there's good scholarship about how the skull was seen in Babylon. And the particular thing, the particular continuity is that the skull was fundamental in communicating with the dead spirits in necromancy. So with the skull, they believed that they had not just the power over the life of but the power of them in the next world. And this is an important way or context to understanding a notion of intelligence. When we're talking about intelligence, we have to remember it's knowledge about ourselves, it's knowledge about other people, like, and that could be in the statecraft intelligence, central intelligence, but it's also the spiritual intelligences. That's part of it. So even the CIA is interested in all those intelligences. This is what John Dee was interested in, all those intelligences. So people that want to rule the world or want to rule a country, they want to rule all those intelligences, including the spiritual world. And magical powers, magical practices, sorcery, focused on the skull. So we can see then a connection up to the Grail. We can see this, you know, when you say skull, the idea of drinking out of the skulls in the Nordic culture, it was getting power. We see it in the Irish context, in the Celtic context, in the Welsh stories. So in the Welsh stories, we have Bran. Now, I couldn't find the etymology of the word brain, and I wonder whether is there any connection with Bran. And of course, Bran's skull was supposedly buried under the White Hill where Tower Hill is in London. So the skull was buried there as a magical protection of Britain from France and other countries. So this is so for the Celts, the skull was critical. So this is an overall culture. So to get power over a person's life and of their immortal soul, so you could maybe enlist them to help you in this context, you wanted to get power over the skull. So there's this sorcerous, magical significance about the skull that's in all cultures before we get to Golgotha, and in parallel to that.
Hi guys, I'd like to welcome back James Tunney to the show. James was here not so long ago, and we had a great discussion. I enjoyed listening to him very much. And tonight he's going to be talking about Golgotha. Golgotha, or Calvary, is one of the most significant events in the last 2,000 years. Whether you think it was a mere invention or a real series of events that is well recorded, it has still had a profound effect on religion, philosophy, culture, and art. At a time when the cult of scientism is undermining spiritual belief, there is a question about the continuing relevance of Golgotha. Is it possible that there are aspects of the crucifixion that we may have missed? Is there something relevant in the signs of Golgotha, such as the skull, which speak to us today? What does the skull symbol mean? Does esoteric interpretation shed any light on the death of Jesus Christ for our times or the future? So, James, what got you into this? Why are you interested in this topic?
The reason why I am, Michael, and thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to talk to you again. The reason why I am is because I'm very interested in mystical literature, as you know, esoteric literature. And I've been reading a lot of, over the years, I've been reading a lot of stuff about Golgotha and Calvary and the crucifixion. And a lot of it is not very insightful. And a lot of it, particularly when we come to ideas associated in the New Age, which are popular in the New Age, like the cosmic Christ and all that, they don't make sense to me, and they seem to be serving a different purpose, and that's the thing that concerns me. As well as that, we have to recognize that what I call the empire of scientism, the New World Order, its objective is to destroy religion. So there's a lot of people involved in this project of destroying religion. And it won't be just Christianity. When that's done, Islam will go too. The objective is to get rid of religion. This is fundamental objective of H.G. Wells. And there's many people involved in that project, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes unknowingly, on the left and on the right. And one of the ways that is one of the planks in that policy is to attack the basis of Western culture, and in particular Christianity, not apart from the religious context, but the cultural context. And Western culture is heavily based, or is based, on Christian culture, as well as we could add in Celtic culture, Nordic culture, and a mixture, but it's a very strong common element. So what I wanted to do, and in view of the fact that you've addressed some of the issues in some of your interviews in this area, I thought it was appropriate to raise my analysis of what happened at Golgotha, or rather, why Golgotha is significant still, or can be read as significant if we approach it from an esoteric perspective. And that follows on. I've done talks. I've talked with Dr. Mishlove on New Thinking Aloud about Steiner and the mystery of Golgotha. So Steiner in particular focused on Golgotha as the most important event in human history. And he was, of course, very into theosophy and anthroposophy, and very au fait as a mystic for a whole range of contexts. So he thought that Golgotha was critical. If you look at Jung thought that crucifixion and the life of Jesus was critical for the idea of individuation. Ivan Illich thought that the life of Jesus was critical for the origin of our conception of life. So what I'm concerned about is that now because we know that the scientocracy, the technocracy, the technotronic society wants to pull out the foundations of Western culture in order for it to establish its culture without morality, without, with just a power-based culture. They have to destroy these things. And one of the ways they destroy it is by increasing doubt and arguing that, for example, this is just a story, it's a myth, it didn't exist, it didn't happen. Whereas other things like Prometheus is almost accepted as a fact of history and is still relevant to people. So what I want to suggest is that you can... I think that the general descriptions of what happened at Golgotha are accurate historically, and that's what C.S. Lewis' views was, and Tolkien and people that understood about myth, understood the distinction between myth and understood about history. They were in the center of the study of one of the world centers of history. They could distinguish between the two. So I share that view of C.S. Lewis, that it's a factual event which is of mythic proportions, which corresponds with myths, but that's a secondary thing. But even if you don't accept the good scholarship about how the evidence was transmitted, and you go back and read good scholarship about it, even if you don't accept that, and you say, well, this is a myth, well, strangely then, you have a higher obligation to examine it as a myth. And I'd give the example. If people are so interested in Jordan Peterson talking about Pinocchio and are willing to accord a lot of attention to, say, his reading of Pinocchio or Cain and Abel, by the same token, it seems very, very strange that we wouldn't give a similar reading to the crucifixion, a major event in the history in the last 2,000 years. So what I want to do is to argue that there are, or to sketch out some elements of Golgotha, which I think prefigure our times. And in every generation, these stories, events, prove to have different layers of meaning. So there's, and the avenue of interpretation I'd point to is mainly the Protestant one, going back to Jacob Boehme, Swedenborg, Blake. This is where a lot of Western esotericism came from. The whole of Spiritism we can trace back around the world, back to Swedenborg. We can trace some of American transcendentalism back to Swedenborg. And Boehme is critical in a number of spiritual traditions, and he talked about the signature of things, the sign. So I'm saying, if we look at the story of Golgotha, there's a critical sign there, which is relevant, which proves the validity of the story in a factual terms, if you want, or in mythical terms, in both, that there's something in there which is telling us about our present moment, which is anticipating our present moment. So I want to draw attention. Now, this is my view, so I appreciate. I don't care if one laughs at it or says that's ridiculous. That's fair. I'm just putting it on the table as my hypothesis and ask people to look at the significance of the sign of the skull. And the last point, I was just talking about this yesterday as a matter of interest. You know, I'm interested in art, and so as well as that, we're losing Western art. Western art is disappearing. The West is going to fall on the current trajectory. It's quite clear to anyone with half a brain. We're going to lose the basis of Western culture and all the things, including humanists. But we're losing things. We're losing knowledge of not just religion, but of the art of the West, of the art of the Renaissance, of the art of that period. And I just want to draw attention. I was looking at this yesterday. This is the famous picture from 1533. I'm referring to this one here, the ambassadors. Now, this is the most famous picture. You can look it up on the internet, but just that's kind of important, an important piece of evidence in my view. And again, people can look at that, but it's relevant in relation to the story. So you can remind me to come back to that picture to explain what it is. So my interest is to say that I've had enough of some of the views which are going unchallenged. For example, and we see this sign of the skull as a very strong motif with the bad guys. So this is the dark side. I want to explain what that is as well. So it means two different things, the sign of the skull. And think of how significant the skull is from the opposite perspective. They say, well, Michael, you're an ape. You know, that's what they're saying now. You're an ape, and we need to improve your substrate because you're an ape, you're dangerous. You know, and apes are dangerous. They fight, they're aggressive, and they use tools, they pick up instruments. This is the argument that they're using to us. And of course, that's not even what evolutionary theory says if we take it on its own terms. And a lot of this argument refers back to a particular chain of skulls that they found. And if we look at people like Teilhard de Chardin, who I'm not a fan of, the paleontologist, the Jesuit priest, well, he was involved in the Piltdown hoax, for example. Now, whether he was consciously involved is another issue, but those events he was involved in. He was also involved in the Peking Man. This is the skull that was found in China that was very significant for Chinese nationalism. So this skull was a force which drew the Chinese together in their nationalism to make communism work in China. And these skulls that Teilhard de Chardin approved of or dated, they mysteriously disappeared when they were going to be examined in America. So there's this curious feature of a lot of our historical evidence of the evolution of man in the way that it's presented to us has these weaknesses, but in that there's a focus on the power of the skull in all this. And I want to draw people's attention to the significance of the skull. We see it so often that we don't actually analyze it or we don't approach it in analytical terms. So what I'm suggesting is that if we look at the story of Golgotha, of Calvary, that there are layers to it that suggest a relevance to the battle for our skulls today, and that's why I'm interested in it.
So when you say the skull, you're saying you're not talking metaphorically, you're speaking literally, that there's a battle for what's going on in our heads, for our thoughts, for our minds, for what we think. Is this what you mean, or are you differentiating?
It's both. It has all those connotations, all those different layers. For example, when you go into a dome in a cathedral, you know, there's a lot of arguments and by people like Otto Rank and that you know, these things represent the skull. I mean, our architecture is the significance of some of the dome. This is a reference to that. It's all about us. The reference to the human body and architecture. It's all about. So there are different levels. There is a symbolic representation, a symbolic contrast, a symbolic argument, a symbolic contest. there is the internal one for what's inside the skull, and there's an actual contest to own what's in your skull, including your brain, obviously, in that. Yes.
These neural links that they're trying to put into us,
Exactly.
so
Human brain interface. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm suggesting is that a lot of this, the current science, is actually an ancient form of magic that's going on. It's a continuation of a constant effort to engage in magic. As Arthur C. Clarke says about sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. They use magic all the time now about artificial intelligence. They keep telling us it was like magic. They keep telling us the genie is out of the bottle. They're betraying their, I won't say mystical, their magical approach, their sorcerer's approach that people like Norma Wiener said. So I'm saying that this is an actual policy. This is an actual policy. Perhaps I could explain some of the darker bits, but if you have another question.
No, just when you were talking there about the skull and the symbology of it in general, even you can make you can make a connection with, one of the most famous philosophical concepts of Plato's cave.
Yes.
So like even there, the relevance is high. Do you see any connection there with what Plato was?
Direct connection. There's a direct connection between the resurrection and Plato's cave, in my view. There's an argument that what happened at Golgotha was anticipated, and that it explains as well. Escaping from the cave is a different level to understanding the significance of the empty tomb. I do see a direct relevance to the resurrection element of the crucifixion, which occurred in the same place. So they were very proximate in Jerusalem. So the resurrection and the crucifixion were in the same place and presumed to be on Golgotha, although there's.
Yeah. Is this what you mean by the cosmic Christ? That after the resurrection, that the cosmic Christ burst through the confines of the skull, of the limitations of
that would be a positive view, but this is not. That would be a positive view, but and Steiner is more inclined to that view, and that I can support, that the intervention and the crucifixion changed, if you like, all the planes of the astral planes, the esoteric planes. But the cosmic Christ afterwards in the 20th century became a sop, if you like, to when they've taken all the Christian stuff out to begin to describe in vague terms. So, of course, Desjardins was really a transhumanist, and he was a supporter of transhumanism. So they begin to make reference, you say cosmic Christ, to make people feel comfortable to believe that actually they're referring back. But all of the things is inconsistent with Christianity insofar as Christianity, the main thing of Christianity that is relevant, that we see in the writers and the critics of technology, is the idea of incarnation, the significance of that spirit is in flesh. This is critical, that idea of incarnation. It's a very deep idea. So when we come to people like Jacques Ellul and Charbonneau, when they're searching around for answers to the technological society, even though Charbonneau was not that interested in religion later on, they believe that the Christian story and incarnation is a critical antidote, because the direction of the technological society, as they anticipated, was to remove or to try and separate consciousness from its body, to try and divorce them. And that brought them back to say, well, actually, this element of the God figure coming into flesh has an extra significance. Now, we could see that in relation to Krishna and an Indian context, but it's particularly relevant in relation to the Christian story.
What are the different, you mentioned Boma earlier on. What are the differences between Boma and Swedenborg? Like, how do they differ in their thinking?
Burma he was a lot more mystical in relation to his use of alchemy and alchemical terms, and he was more specific, whereas Swedenborg was a great scientist, of course, and he was more interested in the text and interpreting the text, as well as kind of left brain and right brain. So his main starting point was that the Bible can't be interpreted in a purely literal way. And this is an ancient idea that the Jews, in certain traditions, the mystical Jews said that the literal interpretation is the darkest level. You had to go under for the other level. So, for example, if you're approaching the creation of the earth in 7 days or the world in 7 days, that means different things. It can refer to the 7 chakras in the body. It can refer to 7. There's different meanings, different layers we can find there. And so that's the same principle. The relevance of Burma, I think, is focus on signs. Now, this would be where William Butler Yeats gets his focus on symbols, and his ideas of magic are based on his focus on symbols. So this would be a real. This would go back to Burma, which would go back to the Bible and the saying that God reveals himself in signs and wonders. It's in the text itself that signs are important. So the idea is that at a higher level, instead of having a big long text, for example, that there are signs, there's synchronicities, there are connections that you have to be aware of or focus that clarify things.
You mentioned you're mentioning signs. So the sign of the skull, signs and symbols, they go beyond language. So they're understood by people all over the world without having to resort to language, for example. So what significance do you think the skull has to different cultures? Apart from the West, as you said earlier on, the Western culture, and that it's in its death throes at the moment. What significance does the skull have for different cultures? Like
well, here's the question. I mean, if you go out in the street and where you are there and ask somebody, they will presume that they know what it is. But if you dig a bit deeper, you won't get very, very far in relation to it. It means different. It means different things. If we look at it for the SS, for example, well, it's a death symbol. And this is the crucial consistency. It's a sign of power. If I have control over your head, that I have control over it. If I chop your head off, I have control over it. But it's deeper than that. So then we go back to the older ideas, and this is where we have to, before we talk about Golgotha, perhaps it's interesting to think of it in this way. For example, when George Bush was going up against John Kerry, what did they both share in common? The two people that are standing for the American presidency, they were both members of the Skull and Bones Society. Now, we can say, oh, we can joke and dismiss that. That's the same as his father, I think, George Bush Sr. And we can look back and see there's loads of American presidents involved in the Skull and Bones. Well, why were they involved in this Skull and Bones? What was so significant about a body which was officially called the Russell Trust Association, which is another avenue. I'm not going to go down there, but some other time. But so they're interested in this and kind of occult practices and having skulls of Geronimo and whoever they have. This is, and they're trying to whitewash these things as if there's no other dimension to it. But there's a clear connection, and in fact, as with Arthur C. Clarke looks back to, surprisingly, back to Babylon, as we see the description from John Maynard Keynes of Isaac Newton as the last great magician, and it traces him in a lineage back to Babylon. Strangely, one of the founding documents of the Skull and Bones Society seems to be about the fall of Babylon. A lot of this stuff goes back to Babylon. Now, there's good scholarship. Now, so this is not, at this stage, it's not a conspiracy theory. There's good scholarship about how the skull was seen in Babylon. And the particular thing, the particular continuity is that the skull was fundamental in communicating with the dead spirits, in necromancy. So with the skull, they believed that they had not just the power over the life but the power of them in the next world. And this is an important way or context to understanding a notion of intelligence. When we're talking about intelligence, we have to remember it's knowledge about ourselves, it's knowledge about other people, and that could be in the statecraft intelligence, central intelligence. but it's also the spiritual intelligences. That's part of it. So even the CIA is interested in all those intelligences. This is what John Dee was interested in, all those intelligences. So people that want to rule the world or want to rule a country, they want to rule all those intelligences, including the spiritual world. And magical powers, magical practices, sorcery, focused on the skull. So we can see then a connection up to the Grail. We can see this, when you say skull, the idea of drinking out of the skulls in the Nordic culture, it was getting power. We see it in the Irish context, in the Celtic context, in the Welsh stories. So in the Welsh stories, we have Bran. Now, I couldn't find the etymology of the word brain, and I wonder whether is there any connection with Bran. And of course, Bran's skull was supposedly buried under the White Hill where Tower Hill is in London. So the skull was buried there as a magical protection of Britain from France and other countries. So this is so for the Celts, the skull was critical. So this is an overall culture. So to get power over a person's life and of their immortal soul, so you could maybe enlist them to help you in this context, you wanted to get power over the skull. So there's this sorcerous, magical significance about the skull that's in all cultures before we get to Golgotha, and in parallel to that. Now look at it today. What does a skull mean? What do you point out? If you're pointing to your children about when you skull, you stay away from it. Why? Because the skull represents poison. Who makes the poison? Well, a lot of big businesses do. The poison cartel, as Vandana Shiva talks about, is the skull. It's the sign of this. I'm sure all the biolabs that are being, spread out around the world as they're developing their new things to kill us with, they will have skulls on them. This is not just a sign of danger, a sign of death. It's a sign of a force of power. If we look back in Elizabethan, they talk about law and order in Elizabethan England in the context that John Dee was working about. Sometimes a third or bigger of the total national revenue came from pirates that the Queen had, the sea pirates. And, of course, skulls are associated with piracy. So this idea of the power of the skull in a dark sense is ubiquitous throughout history, and often in a sense of giving magical power. Now, of course, skulls are used in secret societies, many secret societies. I'm not going into all that, but there's a similar thing. Now, of course, they say, oh, well, a skull is a sign that you're, of death, to remind you of death and all, usually, okay, yeah, but not really. That may be there. But usually that's a kind of a watery middle version. For a lot of people, the skull is a sign of power. And of course, we look at the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields in Cambodia, and Pol Pot and his great new pastoral utopia that he was building. Was built on the piles of skulls after he applied his favorite philosopher Rousseau to to the real world scenario. That's the skulls are the sign of power. They have been the skull towers over Europe, as a sign of power. So, but the sign of power is not just that I can chop your head off, that I can, here is I've defeated my enemy. It's also that I'm able to communicate with your spirit and control your spirit. This is a deep kind of belief, and use this skull to communicate as this particular relationship. This is a kind of deep belief. So there's an occult kind of connection that goes in there. So that's the dark power of the skull. That it's difficult to avoid that if one looks at it. And of course, people will come up with other explanations, but I define them. And here is one of the points about this thing again. I don't know if you can see it or if you know this thing.
I can see it, yes.
But the famous one here is this here.
Can you put that a bit closer, James, just so I get it? Yeah.
So this is an anamorphosis. It's a skull. You see it from a different angle, and you say, "Well, what is this? What's this about?" You know, and we look at the symbol. So that's done by Holbein in 1533, and it's called the Ambassadors. It was done in the Bridewell prison. It was done in the place where Henry VIII was just before the Reformation. So it's just at that time. So what we see in the picture, there's books written about the Ambassadors and what it means, but what we see in it is two French men. That's the French, and we have all the symbols of the globe, of the anticipated application of science to the global context. It's representing a new phase of imperial conquest, in my view. This is not the standard view, and we have all the symbols of things that are going to be important in relation to sailing and establishing power over the world. And what's very, very interesting in that is that up in the corner, right behind the curtain, is a little crucifix. Now, a lot of people debate this. And what the academics say about this, again, a lot of them I don't agree with. They say, well, it's shown the religious strife, or it's shown religious power. In my view, it's showing the eclipse of Christianity.
Now, the crucifix is in the actual picture, the Ambassadors, right?
Yeah. In the picture, if you look up in the top left-hand corner, there's green curtains, and peeping out a little bit is part of the crucifix, not the entirety thing. So it's hidden in some way. And why it's hidden is a matter of debate. So I was explaining this to someone recently, and this is what's quite interesting. So what I would argue is that this was showing a deeper application or deeper anticipation of the eradication of Christianity as a cultural and religious force in favor of a technical approach. Okay, that's what I believe. And so I was showing this to someone. I was saying, have a look at the crucifix in that, and they said, in this picture, and they said, there's no crucifix in it. And I looked at it, and this is masterpieces of Western art. And actually, what they did was they cut out the bit. The crucifix is up here, and they cut it out. And which I thought, that kind of confirms my suspicion about that. What we have in a lot of this is an effort to excise the Christian story, even in little things like that. Now they'll say, oh, well, there's other reasons, but I found that very, very strange. This is a few hundred years after we have this continuation of the eclipsing. But that is the story. That is the point. The point is that Western culture, the antithesis to empire, which the Jesus figure was the antithesis to the Roman Empire, is being cut out insofar as it can stop the empire of scientism. And it's a continuing story. And that's the location in which people are trying to reduce, and academics are trying to reduce, the significance of Golgotha. And that's why I think it's interesting to look back and say, well, hold on, bearing in mind that the skull is an important symbol, that it's important in art history, it's important cultural history, it's important in myth, it's important in legend. But what is it saying here? What is the relevance? And you anticipated some of them there, which you referenced Plato. This is a number of different levels. Plato's cave is us being controlled socially, or us even internally controlling ourselves and confining our own spirit by an inappropriate idea of the external world. They're saying now, the scientists, they've just discovered that we can't rely on our view of the outside world. It's kind of some great new theory, but really, this is every ancient philosopher has been saying that you have to be very careful.
I'm thinking about Immanuel Kant as well, knowing the thing in itself, that it was impossible, the noumena. So it's kind of like connected there in that sense. I'm just looking on the internet. I was looking there around the internet, the picture of the ambassadors. I can't see the crucifix. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong.
Up on the top left-hand corner, a grey. It's a kind of grey silver. In the extreme left hand, you can see it. I checked it out. It's on the internet. The picture they have of the ambassador, right up at the top, in the top left hand corner. There's a split in the curtains, and you'll see the crucifix.
I see it.
Yeah,
I see it right just behind the curtain. That's amazing.
yeah. They're getting ready to close the curtains on the Christian era, and here they're telling us, consciously or unconsciously, it's closed. We're moving into the post-Christian era. I mean, it really that's not this is not an accident. I'm not saying these guys are doing that deliberately, but it really is about the eclipse of this story, saying nothing to see here. We're closing this. We're moving ahead with our scientific instruments, and that's another story. But
you've got the globe, you've got the musical instrument, you've got symbols of Western culture, and it's kind of like they're closing the curtain on the cross. On
yes, yeah. I think we're moving into post-Christian Europe, for example. I think, and so I'm kind of prepared for that in my head. I don't think a lot of other people are going to be prepared when they realize what that means, when they've thrown out a lot of values that were associated with Christian culture. And they're not going to find it pleasant, or their children are not going to find it pleasant, unfortunately. So they've given up that too easily. And just the last point on a contemporary cultural context, I've been talking about the technosphere. That's not my term. It was coined by someone else, but I use that as a description of our future. And look at these spheres that are growing up. U2, the sphere of Las Vegas, spheres everywhere. They're going to appear everywhere. This is part of the thing. You go into a dome and you're amazed because you have this counterfeit world. I mean, they're projecting pictures on an ugly old wall, and people, wow, this is amazing. They're going into the cave voluntarily, with looking at their mobile phone as they're walking into the black chamber. It's better than the real thing, even better than the real thing. And U2 are there, of course, named after a Lockheed bomber. No irony there. And they're telling us, they're singing songs like Zoo Station, on a different level. This is great irony or something else, the zoo. And anyway, that's another story. But I mean,
Bono identifies as a Christian, no? He identifies.
I won't get into that today. But I won't talk about him personally in that context. What I would say is that in a lot of this stuff, there are different strands in Christianity. There are so many thousands of different strands in this. I'm very critical, for example, I've talked about John Nelson Darby, and I'm very critical of the rapture philosophy. Now, I would say to my Protestant friends who believe in the rapture, that if you look at it, there's a lot of evidence for me that this really was a construction that suited the needs of the British Empire, and that while you're waiting for the rapture, unfortunately, I think you'll find you're going to be in Babylon in the real world very shortly, while you're waiting for this thing to happen. I think so within Christianity, there are some streams which, well, I can't connect them to what I read about in the New Testament. A lot of these Christian denominations refer back to the Old Testament, which is something that I can't. They value the Old Testament more than the New Testament, which is something that I've never figured out. What I'm saying is that actually we're moving into something which is a new Babylon. This is always the H.G. Wells indicated in his book, one of his novels, that one of the centers of the New World Order would be in Basra. It's quite remarkable. This is where the George Bush, Skull and Bones, etc., are bringing the war to without justification. And Basra, they're fighting for Basra. Arthur C. Clarke talked about the significance of Babylon, and a number of theorists have said that the Toynbee as well, that the future capitals would be around in the Middle East. And we see this shift of money towards cities that didn't exist, Dubai and places that didn't exist. They're British imperial corporate setups, really, and other empires combined. They're shifting emphasis over to places that they believe was the birthplace of civilization, the Omphalos, etc. Yeah, but in relation to Bono, again, I don't want to talk about him, but what I would say, there is a very strong stream in Christianity, or particular type of Christianity, which has been very supportive of war in the last 50 years, which has supported the overthrow of countries around the world, which has supported power, which has supported military power. Of course, remember that I think it was after the Iraq War, Bono was describing Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as like Lennon and McCarthy. So they don't have a problem with these guys doing that. They seem to be very supportive of that. I don't see that as consistent with Christianity. I'm sorry, but I see that as consistent with empire, and I don't think that that's what Christianity is about. So without talking about the man's individual views, if you look at as a public figure in relation to what they do, I don't see it. But there is a last point. They did have in this thing a big emphasis on the cross. There was a cross in their great new show, and my question would be, really, is this? Well, I predicted it elsewhere. The growth of a simulacrum. It's not the real thing. It's nearly even better than the real thing. It's a simulacrum with no reference to anything substantive, but to a vague symbolic thing that plays on the harp strings of our memory.
What is being a Christian for you? What does it mean, being a Christian?
The essential essence is about the significance of the spirit in flesh and the significance of the recognition of your persistence and the survival of consciousness, survival of spiritual consciousness. The imperative that I recognize that you have the same thing, you are of the same stuff, that we have spiritual light, and that spiritual light will persist. The recognition that this is a karmic universe, that there's consequences to what we do, and that there is the evolution is intended, spiritual evolution is intended to bring us up to a higher level. That has an imperative in relation to the use of power and the non-misuse of power, which is set against empire, which is set against giving your power away to someone else. But it's about those two things, about the significance of the human embodied in flesh, living and suffering, if you like, in this environment as part of a journey to go to a different level. I was just thinking we better get on to focus on Golgotha. So I lay out the. Oh,
let's do it. Let's do it, James.
Yeah. Sorry, did I answer your question on that?
Yeah, you did. I was trying to, so like I got the impression there, like for example, Bono, he's very enmeshed in the state, in the Caesar side of things.
Yeah, there's no question about that. There's no question about that. So the one thing I would ask you to consider when you're looking at the evidence about, again, not him, anyone that claims about their Christian beliefs. There's been a lot of reports, the YouTube. I remember over the years, always reported they're fighting over religion and all that, and you have to take some of these things with a pinch of salt. What group, and etc. Which is these groups that they're involved in? Which are the? Yeah, I'll say no more about. Mm-hmm. But so Tony Blair is, again, I don't want to talk about the people and their personal beliefs, but a lot of figures that are claiming religious viewpoints, and if you look at what they're claiming, they're using it as a lever to wage war. So in the context of the Iraq War, they talk about this Babylon, all that, and they use it as a lever to their constituencies. These guys don't believe in. Some of these guys don't believe in.
So I guess in a way, like for example, when Jesus said, "I didn't come to bring peace; I came to bring the sword," they're taking that literally. Whereas
I don't think they're using most of them don't use Jesus at all. They use the Old Testament. This is a consistent thing. Francis Bacon as well. They use the myth of the fall, Tower of Babel as the base. Their references to Christ is much less. It's much less in relation to the story, because I think they're happier with something that brings them back to Babylon and that context. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'll get going with me. With the argument I want to put forward. So what I would suggest is that if we look at the story of the crucifixion, there are strange elements of it that prefigure some of the issues that we're talking about in relation to control of the mind. Now, so I'm suggesting that it's inherent in the story as a divine story, as a divine story that has to be read, or if you want to call it a myth. If you say, well, I don't believe in that, look at it as a myth and ask why this story is so significant, has had so much influence in culture, and what does it mean in relation, and now after having contextualized it in the context of the existing symbolism in relation to schools. So the first point is that we know that the sign of the skull is important by its recurrence in the story. It's critical, and in recurrence in how artists have seen this story. So sometimes, if you want to know about a sign, you look at what other artists who are seers, whether they've dealt with some of these things, and you'll find corroboration. I'll give you an example here. There is an essay in 1952 by Philip K. Dick about a savior, which kind of, in a very short story, you can read it, it's available on the internet. It's an excellent short story, which would give an explanation for how you could have a resurrection.
What's the name of it?
Well, guess. It's the skull.
The skull, okay.
So what that tells me is that Philip K. Dick, as an artist, is recognizing the sign of the skull. Of all the things you could pick out, he focuses on the skull. Another example, when there was debate, especially with the Protestants and the Catholics, about where the tomb that Jesus rose from was. And General Gordon, who was a kind of mystic, went to Jerusalem. Now, when he was there, he was really looking for things associated with the skull. And he therefore focused on a place which looked like a skull. There's a place nearby and where the garden tomb is. And because it looks like a skull, he thought that that was the place where where Jesus was buried. Now, that was a good instinct, I think. I think it was a good instinct to look for the sign, but it shows me that he too, from a different perspective, is coming at it and saying the skull is important in this context. And of course, if we look through a lot of art of the crucifixion, there's nearly always, or in a lot of cases, there's a skull at the bottom of the cross. There's a skull at the bottom of the cross. So that's an important, so the depictions are important because it tells us something. Why are the skulls there? I'll answer that in a second. But the first point that we can't get away from is the place name. It's Golgotha, Golgotha, whatever way you want to pronounce it. So it's Aramaic and Hebrew. It's the place of the skull, or it can be in plurals, but it's the place of the skull. So we can say that that's just an accident. That's insignificant, but there is a significance in it. And also in Latin, it's Calvary, and the Calvarium is this place on your skull. It refers literally to the skull. So that's not that's a kind of, cranium is another word they use in Greek. Everything, all the language refers to and is pointing to the significance of the skull. So this being the place where the crucifixion and the resurrection happens, it has to be important. Why is there a skull in the iconography of all of a lot of the pictures? You'll see it if you begin to look at it. It was believed that Adam's skull was buried there in the same place, and also possibly Goliath's skull. So here we have a connection, a deep connection that goes back to the origins and deep belief. So the fact of it being Golgotha, the place of the skull, which also has a connotation of the place of other significant skulls, which is parallel to Bran and the Tower White Hill in London, which again refers back to Celtic legends, is another indication. It's another corroboration that the skull is important in this story, whether you accept it as fact or whether you accept it, but whether it's not a question of whether Adam's skull, we could find Adam's skull there, or whether we could find Goliath's skull there. It's a question of what people believe to be the case. So that's important. So the names are critical, and the artistic perceptions are important. And then if we look at other artistic perceptions about the passion, we see, for example, if you look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, when Jack in the film, when Jack Nicholson or the character Randall McMurphy is getting his electroconvulsive therapy, he's on the bed. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the technology associated with therapy and psychiatry came from cyberneticians. People like William Gray Walter, who was a cybernetician who worked on robots. They were the ones that developed things like ECGs and that. So there's a correspondence between this that can't be ignored. You know, we tend to put things in different compartments when we shouldn't do. So Ken Kesey describes this thing around as a crown of thorns. Now, it's a very, very good description. So this idea that the crown of thorns has an extra or a parallel was something that he perceived as an artist. Where have I seen this thing going around the thing before? I've seen it in the crown of thorns. It's not something that can be dismissed. That's a very profound book, a profound anticipation of the combine that rules the world with pharmaceuticals and with soft-spoken, censorship, etc., with the voice of reason, but really going to take your free will away. So I don't see some of those references as something that should be. It's important. It's the artist saying, look at the parallel here. So, in relation to the crucifixion itself, remember you probably looked at, or you've certainly heard about Ian McGilchrist's books on the master and the servant and the matter with things, and his great work explaining the difference between the left brain and the right brain, and the argument that would become too left brain focused, and the left brain is blind to certain things, it can't see things, and it's leading us to a great problem. Now, funny enough, I think that's prefigured, or it's in the story of the robbers on the cross. So if we think about it, we have Jesus as the central determining force, and we have, if you like, the left brain and the right brain. One figure says, a robber, so it's someone that will take something from you. So one says, well, if you're God, or if you are who you say you are, throw yourself down, and prove to us. Now this is representative. This says it better in many ways. I'm not saying better than McGilchrist, but it represents that attitude. It's the attitude of Thomas Huxley, which says that agnosticism, you have to prove it to me. So Thomas Huxley has the exact same attitude. And remember, Thomas Huxley, of course, using his skulls, was the founder of scientific racism in many senses. The idea when they found the skulls, oh, look, this skull means that we can put the Irish down here just between the apes, and then we put the Africans here. And this is what the scientific racism was about. The skull, about the interpretation of the skull before Desjardins came. So the guy says, well, prove to me that you are who you are. And the other one says, well, they weren't obviously too sure before, because there's different versions of it, but there's only, but in relation to the significant one, he says, well, I believe you are who you say you are. And then that statement of belief is sufficient to eradicate all the previous condition. Didn't matter. He didn't have to go to confession for 2 years and do a whole lot of, it was as the first kind of appointed Christian after the crucifixion. Here's a boy who's probably not a model member of society. It could be a rebel. And it was the belief that was important. And that's a right brain thing. That's a right brain perceptive thing. So when I'm reading this story, which I always thought was significant, it prefigures what McGilchrist is saying in an incredibly simple way, that we're we're faced with this in relation to our future. We're faced with a profound skepticism, which wants proof, and a profound power of belief, which operates with its instincts or its deeper sense. So I think there's a prefiguration of what's happening now in a strange sense. I see this being kind of relevant, a kind of a transparency that fits on and maps on well to this environment. So if we take the name Golgotha, Calvary, Cranion, if we look at the name, we look at the focus of art, if we look at the link with Adam, if we look at the link with Goliath, and if we look at a number of different angles, even the robber story, we have something which is telling us something about the brain. There's two other elements which I think are kind of significant. They are significant for me. Now, again, it will take, on these ones, it may take a leap of the imagination for people, but what I would explain to them is I've been studying the manipulation of the brain and brainwashing for quite a bit, and the literature and the scientific literature. So that's why I come on these issues. One issue, well, I'll come back to that. It's about the cross itself and the shape of the cross. I'll come back to that. I'll take the other one. If you look at William Blake and William Blake's depictions of the crucifixion, one thing that he did depict was the Roman soldiers drawing lots. So that again, that's just telling us something about, some of these things were commissions and that, but the things he chooses to do and the things he does are important. So Blake is focusing on the significance of the Roman soldiers. Remember that they got a share of his clothes, and then there was one garment that they drew lots for. Now, the reason why they drew lots and didn't divide it was a seamless garment. So it was made of one piece of material. So it wasn't stitched together. This is a critical bit. Now, a lot of theologians say, well, the seamless garment means a whole lot of things. I've never found a convincing explanation. They believe, actually, some people believe that the relic or the actual garment is in Trier in Germany, funny enough, where Karl Marx was born, which I think is a funny little coincidence, but I don't know. I won't draw any or speculate about that. But so this seamless garment is what they have a raffle. They draw lots for, and it's you kind of wonder, well, what is the significance of that? Is there any significance to it? And again, as I said, there's a lot of theologians, and they suggest the significance, but I don't find it convincing. They suggest that it's a sign of that all the theories have to be taken together and you can't take out one. I don't agree with that. There is also a long belief that the seamless garment was made by his mother, because this would have been a thing that happened. Your mother gave you a document or a tunic that you wore underneath, and it was good out in the desert, and you could wear it for your life. But they worked on this particular garment. I think made of wool, but it was an important thing. But it was one piece. So now, just pause there for a second. Jump to some of the contemporary world. Just put it back in the contemporary world for a second. You ask yourself, why are we being told that we're going to be eating insects? What you must have heard. I've said it to some of my friends. I didn't hear about that. What eating? It's all over the place. If you look at the future, it's going to be environmentally friendly. You're going to be eating bugs. You're going to be eating insects. It's on the way. The food is there already. Insects. Save the planet. It's remarkable. It doesn't make any sense. It's horrific. It's remarkable. A lot of it is indigestible stuff. You say, well, what's that about? So it's very, very difficult to figure out. You've come across that, I'm sure, Mike. Yeah.
Yes.
So I said it to one of my friends. I said, no, I never heard about that. I said, I don't know what there. Maybe they're interested. Some other thing, not interested in those type of things. But this is a remarkable thing. You're going to be faced with this thing. They're putting it in food already. I mean, and apparently this stuff is very, very dangerous for the body. It's indigestible. So that's one fact. Another fact is that this stuff contains chitin, or Chitin. It's pronounced different ways, but chitin, I think, is the best pronunciation. Chitin. Now, that's associated with what insects have in their skeletal figure, in their shells. Okay, so this is in a lot of this insect stuff. This is the stuff that our children are going to be consuming, or if not us, very soon. And there's a funny thing about chitin in the scientific literature, that chitin is a material which is used in tissue engineering. It creates a scaffolding. Okay? So if I'm wanting, presumably, as I understand it, if I'm wanting to build something in your body, I can use chitin as an agent, as a constituent, to build something in your body. This could turn you into something else, or it could be used to make an addition, perhaps. That would be a nefarious use. So if they use it as they do in relation to tissue engineering, if you consider transhumanism and the experimentation, which the transhumanists have said they'll do. If you go back to J.D. Bernal 100 years ago, the World of Flesh and the Devil, they said that the people that didn't want to change, they would do experiments upon them. So what kind of experiments? Well, maybe they'll be using this chitin to change features in the human body. So you might look like some of these things out of science fiction magazines. And people like Bernal and the crystallographers have been studying chitin for well over 100 years. They've been fascinated with this subject. The same people that are telling us that they're going to transform us. So go back to the New Testament. The seamless garment is a chiton. That's the name in the records. This seamless garment was a chiton. They changed it to I in English. It's the same word. It means a garment. So in this story, the lottery, the Roman soldiers, the imperial soldiers fighting over the garment could have a deeper meaning. There's a direct linguistic connection between the garment. And of course, this is what they're fighting over. We're going to change your body. You can see, I saw people when I was in Spain who looked like they did a lot of body modification in Barcelona, etc. This is a anticipation of the future. Now, if those people want to do that to themselves, that's grand, but I don't want them doing it to me. I don't want to be experimented upon in the future. But really, the technology is becoming available for unscrupulous people. Now, if you had total faith in the authorities who govern us, that's fine, but I don't. So my suggestion is that this connection of the significance of the exact word in relation to the thing that artists have wondered about in this story, about the fighting over the garment of Christ, the seamless garment, which could represent the human body over the spirit. It could represent our human body, our structure, our outward appearance. That it points to the significance and vindicates the significance of this is really important issue in relation, which I've already concluded it is an important issue. But because I have concluded it was an important issue already, this makes me conclude that there's a parallel vindication of the significance of that in the story. The last point, there's some other points. The last point
that's a very original way of looking at it, James.
But it's the mystical way. This is the point that I would like. I studied law. I studied law for 7 years, 3 degrees, taught law for years. So I know about the interpretation of words. I know about the legitimate interpretation of words. You know, the literal view, proposive, whatever, a mixed view. But when we come to mystical texts, there's a different way of interpreting the things. So if we deny what all the mystical interpretations have done, the way they interpret text, the way the great Jewish mystics have interpreted text, or the way Islamic scholars have interpreted text, or the good Christian scholars, even the people interpreting magical text, or the way Jung would interpret a text, and if we look at synchronicities and things like that, it forces us to look at those parallels. And the last kind of weird point, which I'm not saying is the basis of my interpretation, but if you look at what John C. Lilly said, strangely, he said that there was a force which was taking over the world, which was going to transform the world into a single kind of machine thing that would suck up all the resources and get rid of humans, basically. And that was the solid state entity. And this is actually what James Lovelock moved on from Gaia to the Nova scene. He's, as a scientist, is saying this is going to happen. We will be as plants to this thing. So it's not a weird view. But strangely, John Lilly said as well, there's a counterforce. And the counterforce is some kind of other intelligent force in the universe that's trying to help us. And the way that it helps us is through synchronicity. It's a very strange thing. But that corresponds also with Jung's sense of the intuitive power of synchronicity. And it also corresponds with the idea of the sign. So if you think about how did people know that certain plants were powerful? This thing, for example, here's another example with the skull. The doctrine of signatures would say that a walnut is good for your brain because it looks like a skull, and when you open it up, it looks like a brain inside it. So they would say that's God's signature. It's pointing you to it. It's saying, it's making it easy for you. It's saying, look at Michael. Can you not see it? It's like a brain. Look at it. And this, like, you know, a kid can say, oh, this is like a brain. You know, I remember saying that to one of my daughters, and they're saying, is this brain I'm eating? but the parallels are clear, and it's scientifically proven that walnuts are good for your brain. That's a scientific fact. So they were right on their instinct. So that's the doctrine of signatures. It's a strange thing, but it works, and it has worked for intuitives on a different level. You know, the idea that things are speaking to me, that people could read things. We could read what was good for. We knew what was good for us because the things were telling us. They were signaling to us in that strange way. And the medieval people and pre-Christian people believed that was a signature. That was the divine force was telling you, or the plant itself, or what was telling you. As is proven, even ayahuasca, it would be scientifically almost impossible to come up with the exact combination. So sometimes the plant speaks. And the last point, again, which a lot of people might find initially to be obtuse or kind of difficult to swallow, but again, I come from my studying of the literature on this matter and the literature of consciousness, which I've engaged in quite a bit in the last few years, and talked to people who are very good on these issues. There's a possible parallel as well, and this one is possible. And this comes down to what the shape of the cross. What was the shape of the cross that was in the crucifixion? Now, my instincts would suggest that it actually wasn't the cross as we know it. It was the Tau cross. I think the Franciscans used this. So this is the T-shaped cross, and we see that in a fair few artists taught that. So if you look at it's a T-shaped. A number of artists taught that it was a T-shaped cross. The Franciscans and numbers have the Tau cross. There's even a couple of Tau crosses in Ireland. I think there's one in Tory Island, and there's one, not many, and there's one in Clare. I don't know how old they are. Some of these would have been pre-Christian around the place, but there's a strong case that the cross was a Tau cross. Now, why would I think that it might be a Tau cross? Well, if you look at the sutures on the head, on the skull, there's a T shape created between where the plates come together, and suture, it means stitched together, where the word sutra comes from. But so there's a kind of prefiguration that would kind of suggest to me that the again, because of the constant connections, that it might be another reference. It's a possible reference that we don't know for certain about the shape of the cross. The Romans certainly used this T shape. And the T shape, again, would kind of point, it's not fundamental, but it would still point to there is a cruciform structure in the way the plates fix. Again, pointing to the skull as being significant. So again, now I'm working backwards, and I'm kind of doing it in parallel here in relation to comparators. What's very, very strange is that one of the most dominant physiological explanations of consciousness, one of the most promising ones, is the one that Penrose is involved in. And they focus on microtubular quantum connections, etc., in the brain. And if you look at the scientific literature in relation to Alzheimer's and certain diseases, they're beginning to focus on certain proteins as very significant, and as very significant in the way the brain works and in understanding brain disease. And strangely, the name of the ones that are most promising at the moment in the literature are the tubular assisted units. This is the protein. I think that's the correct name. It's an acronym anyway, and the acronym is the tau proteins. So I find that very strange, that the across which a lot of people, or a name that people identify with the crucifixion in a lot of different traditions, has, by a strange process, emerged as the major protein in relation to possibly consciousness, but certainly how the brain works. And again, it is odd. It is odd that you have this connection. So what I'm saying, and there are other possible things we could draw. What I'm saying is, we take the totality. If we take the name, the history of Golgotha itself, the link with Adam, with Goliath, the Plato's tomb connection that you made legitimately in relation to the resurrection, the possible, the chiton, the tau, possibly as a cross, the robbers, the left brain, right brain. What we get is, in my view, is for me, it's an overwhelming mystical indication that this story was meant to be relevant to today. At this point, the story, prophetic thing, because I think when you're looking at prophecies in Christianity, you should look within the best text about the thing itself as opposed to outside it. Within the story itself, you should look in there in the story. So what they point to is a natural lifespan of the original message, that in the Christian thing, it was go and preach to all the nations. Well, the nations won't be around a while, but that message has, we could say that we're at the stage where the message at least has been made available to all the nations. It took a long time. Also, that all the parables are really set in an agricultural society context. If you look at it, if you're in Ireland 50 years ago, these parables spoke to you because you're out with sheep, and it's direct combination. When the society comes to an end of its connection with agriculture, it's going into a different phase. And that may be also part of the explanation why a post-agricultural society may find it a bit more difficult to see the relevance. I suggest that that's maybe written in the thing itself, that as we live for 70 years and 10, or the average, that 70 years and 10 generations would bring us up to about 21 as a natural life. It may have been written into the thing that was the way it was going to be. At that point, that we come to a different crossroads. And at that point, we were going to have to decide on who we are and what we wanted to be. And the resurrection, as you anticipated, is indicating two things. It doesn't take away from the incarnation. The incarnation is the critical thing about the life, in my sense. It's the divine coming into the thing. It mirrors, it shows we are light, we're of the same stuff. You can even see that outside in the Gospel of Thomas, where do you come from? You come from the place where the light came into being of its own accord, etc. That this is indicating who you are. It's reminding who you are, but it's not saying that we should avoid the flesh. It's the opposite. For whatever reasons that is, that's another story about the incarnation. Then we have the guarantee of, even if you don't believe in a particular resurrection story associated with Christianity, even put it in simpler terms, the way, say, Robert Bigelow would put it in terms of his discussion about survival of consciousness. Does consciousness survive? Yes, it does. And consciousness is another word for spiritual consciousness. It was an attempt to replace spirit, language of spirit. So it shouldn't be allowed to do that. This is what Huxley and the schools and all that were doing. We're taking out spirit. So even if we accept on the level, the resurrection is a divine proof, a mythic proof, your consciousness survives afterwards. It's an underlining of that. Your consciousness goes on, your spiritual body. There's debate, of course, about a lot of people believe that you're kind of replicated physically as you are now. I don't believe that. I don't think a lot of people would necessarily want to be, and what age are you, and all this kind of stuff. There's some silly debates about that. It fails to understand that our incarnation may be merely a reflection of our spiritual being, and there's different levels of existence. Our incarnation is peculiarly suited to the environment that we're in, even as the evolutionists say. But so this, instead of being something that is controlled by somebody else, this myth or divinely inspired text tells us that we are the ones that have control over our consciousness. We are the ones that are individuals, that are individuated, that makes the choice, that we have this power which is superior, which doesn't deny the material world, but still reckons that spirit persists, is the essence of us, and that the empire will want to attack the body, to control the skull in particular. But, and the last point, the spiritual nature is not equivalent to the physical context or the containerization of the spirit. And we can see the Holy Grail, some people believe, is the skull as well, but it's not confined to that. In fact, in many cultures and pre-Christian cultures, they didn't believe that consciousness was located in the brain. Other cultures believe it was located in the belly and the stomach and the heart. And the heart, of course, is a key thing. So the story seems to be about the transcendence over the skull. And I was talking to a priest, and he saw me book with a skull, and he was going, but the skull is a Christian symbol, as a triumph over it, not as a misuse of it, but as that this is not who you are. In fact, other elements are more important. There is a tradition of the holy face, for example, the significance of the face. That's why we have Western art. You don't have the face in the same way in Islamic art or in Judaism. There's particular theological reasons for that. You do have it in Christianity, humanism, the Renaissance, art, Western culture was based on this thing, which goes back to a recognition of the reflection of the spirit, the bit we do have control over. We can't control our skull unless we're going to do plastic surgery to it, but we do control our face and our heart and our spirit and our mind. These are the things that are important. So in summary, I think there's a deeper message there. And I think that I do criticize the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, all the Christian denominations that I hear, Islam, Judaism, for failing to engage with this existential problem that are they're coming for our minds and our souls. And you're sitting there with doctrines that are not relevant, with interpretations that are not relevant to particular issues, and coming up with cock and bull stories sometimes and vague things that are not sufficient to address the attack on beings which are created in God's image in a number of different things. That whereas in all the religious traditions and across all the faiths, it's there in the thing, the story of the uniqueness of the human, that it behoves us, whether we're Jewish or Christian or Islamic, to draw on the divine scriptures that inform us in order to counteract sorceress, scientism, which is coming to take away your body, mind, and soul. That's what it's doing. They're telling you that. They're open about that. Ben Goertzel, and I'm grateful for these people for telling us where they stand. So, the more they're open, I'm happy. But Ben Goertzel, leader in AI, said, I'm not playing God. We're not playing God. We're building God. Yuval Noah Harari said, we're going to be gods. But not you, of course, because you are just apes and you are going down. I mean, this is dangerous language. If you look at the history of genocide, this bestialization of people is a prefiguration of genocide. I'm more and more convinced with this language that's being used that we have a genocide is in the making, and we're probably not going to be able to stop it because of this deep misanthropy, this deep hatred of the human, this deep misarticulation of a kind of Malthusian idea, which is very, very deep in imperial context. It's very, very deep in the corporate mindset, which has taken over the imperial mantle. It's not going to end good. There's no way at this stage, and especially because the theologians have been so willing to support the empire, have been so willing to acquiesce, have been so willing to enter into the material world. And last bit of the story I would quote, it's very, very interesting that in relation to the Judas story, that there's the famous thing where Jesus is using the expensive ointment, a spikenard, on his feet, and the woman is putting the spikenard, and who criticizes him? It's Judas Iscariot. And he says, because he's the kind of treasurer, what are you wasting this good money when it could be used on the poor? And this is a brilliant anticipation, because we have all these people that don't care about the poor, which are using the same argument today. You have all these people as if Christopher Hitchens, people think he's fantastic, and that's another. I won't go down that avenue, but there's loads of these people professing to be interested in the poor. It's funny that the story prefigures that as being the Judas figure. What does the Jew? Because I think Judas, again, the story is very relevant. Where is the Judas spirit today? It's the betrayal of the race itself. That the Christian story is the human race itself, which has been betrayed for the machine. And that a lot of this talk about the poor, Bill Gates saying that they're going to program equity now into artificial intelligence, they have no concern about this. They have no sense of the divine nature of the human. In fact, you're an inferior, poor machine, an animal, a plant, which can become mineralized. So, in summary, I think there's a story there. The sign of the skull is something which is relevant to our time. You don't have to join the Catholic Church for that to be the case. You don't have to join anything. It's there in the thing itself. In fact, a lot of the churches are going to collapse. But it doesn't. The thing in itself, as you said, the Kantian thing, it doesn't change. The continuity that have informed all these great artists and people that were not easily won over, whether it be Blake or Philip K. Dick as well. People forget about his Christian context. They know that that's critical significance, as did Steiner, as did Jung, as did most of the great thinkers, as did most of the great scientists, as did most of the great Boyle, etc. They know that story is still critical. Last point before I forget, one example of the nefarious use of skulls was that there's a number of articles and a book, in fact, as well, about cannibalism and scientism in the time of the Royal Society, that it was very common to use skulls in medicines, and people like Robert Boyle and that, they would have used skulls, and in particular skull moss. So this is moss which is scraped off skulls, and there was a ready supply of schools, and they came from Ireland. So the great enlightened leaders were taking schools from Ireland, and they were using them for that's a fact. That's a historical scholarship, and they didn't have to worry about the supply of schools because there was plenty. Because you can see it in some of these supposedly great Elizabethan poets that were involved in, or
Lord Byron used to drink wine out of a skull.
Yeah. It's a. But I mean, in the Elizabethan times and the time of genocide, and that they, when they'd destroy the village, you might be brought to negotiate through a road of skulls. That happened with Gilbert, I think, to the tent of your family to the thing. This is, but they also cannibalized them, So this is another element to the skull. It's absolutely, utterly consistent. Now, if you say, well, not you, but if one says, well, that's nonsense, really go back through history, through art history, through history itself, through myth, through the scholarship, and explain to me why the skull is so significant otherwise. And it's difficult to come up with alternative explanation. The idea, it's a reminder of death and all. Well, it is, yeah, but for a different reason. So that's the bones of the sketch of why I think the sign of the skull, and it is my view. So I put it forward, and I don't care if people say, well, that's ridiculous, but I still put it on the table.
It's a very original, very good view. It's a very good way of looking at it. Very highly original. James, just a question: when the Roman soldiers were fighting over Jesus's garments, why were they drawing lots over his garments? He must have been wearing some pretty nice clothes.
No, he had purple garments. There was two. This one that they're fighting over was the tunic underneath. So they did separate. They did divide the other ones. But the point was, you didn't want to separate a seamless garment. That its value was in its unity, that it didn't have seams, it wasn't stitched, so you wanted the whole thing. So
they were trying to destroy it just to humiliate him. It wasn't that it wasn't like, because I have this image of Jesus and he was wearing he wouldn't have been wearing too fancy clothes. However, if you're going to be drawing lots over wanting somebody, the clothes must have been desirable. He must, like, for example, the soldiers must have said, man, there are some pretty nice garments. I want them. Otherwise, they wouldn't draw lots.
Well, presumably, yeah. I mean, we know that a lot of armies where this is how they get their stuff, by booty, and whatever. So they would have been used to doing this thing. But I presume that a garment which was woven in one piece, which of course, if it's made of a natural material, is going to be useful, and it's also adapted to the particular environment. It's an undergarment, so it could have been an attractive thing in itself, especially if it's made with love, whatever. That's presumably it wasn't as easy if you're in the army to get fine clothes. There may be a resale value of it. We don't know, but I mean they were doing this. But the key thing for me was that the reason why they were having the lots, as far as I can see, was because he didn't want to split it. That's what the significance of the seamlessness there, which I think has there's a deep metaphorical or sign value about this, that the value of something, and in this probably reference to the human body, if it begins to be separated, its value is diminished, because once something comes in the body, it's really all over. There's no going back. Once it starts, it only has to be one intrusion in the human body, and there's no going back. And I believe that has consequences for your spiritual consciousness afterwards. The same as if you were to live your life in a drunken stupor every day, from the time you're a kid to the time you're there's very few religious traditions that would, or spiritual tradition would, say that was a good thing for preparation for the next life. Same token, if you succumb accept, acquiesce, consent to something which can take away your cognitive powers or your ability to do what you want to do. It could even disrupt you by opportunity cost, by making you pay attention to things that you don't want. And that's it done then, because it's the power of attention is the key thing in spiritual traditions. Which is why I also get, when I'm looking at, say, some of these domes that are coming out and they're getting so powerful, that it becomes difficult for people to distinguish between illusion and reality. And also this is a prefiguration to the bigger dome that we're going to be living in.
It was interesting what you said earlier on about the allegories in the Bible, how they're no longer going to be as pertinent as they were before, especially with people moving into cities, like the agricultural element to them. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, my grandfather, told you before, he was in Parliament as senator and a TD, whatever, 7 different times, head of the county council, etc. But he came from a farm in Mayo, and he would have been minding sheep, and he wouldn't have been in school maybe a year or two. So when he was talking, he would have been referring to things, and I remember an old man saying, "Oh, your grandfather used to talk about the sheep coming down and how that would be relevant, etc." So this was the same language that, and I told you, he used to stay with a relation in the field that they used in the film, The Field. So then when you're talking about the most important document in kind of the Western canon, and it's about, sheep and goats, and it's very easy to identify, to understand, to link. It's kind of remarkable that right up to before Ireland became New Ireland, if you like, this thing was relevant. So it makes me now. It's not to say that there's not different levels of meaning that we can't extract from the parrot, but we have to approach it in a different way, because there is for example, the field is strange, doesn't go away, because the field is the new metaphor, but it's a field of a different level. So it will apply in a different way, but you have to think in different terms. So, for example, the untilled or the tilled field is about your spiritual preparation and your spiritual preparation for higher order things. The field is the essence of electromagnetism, the essence of quantum theory, etc. So there's different levels to it that we can reapply it. But it still points to me a hinge point in which we will have to approach some of these things again at a stage when the fundamental issue. So the fundamental issue of Christianity for me is to add back and to reiterate what I'm saying is that we are meant to be, in whatever strange way, we're meant to be enfleshed. We're meant to be incarnated. The meat of us is part of the deal here, whatever way it works out. That's part of the deal. And as a result of that, the idea that we can be taken away, our mind can be taken away, into a different context, is anathema to that. And the only reason why they will be taking the mind away is so they can imprison it. This is what the objective is of to separate, is so it can be imprisoned for eternity. And that's prefigured as well in different contexts. This is what sorcerers do. This is what was in the Tempest, where Ariel is trapped in the tree, trapped in material. This is an anticipation of that. This is what the sorcerer will try to do. You say, yeah, Michael, we'll upload you, whatever. I mean, the implications of it, but I mean, it's more basic. It's more basic than that. So associate with that, if we look at certain things like the power of touch, the power of healing, the laying on of hands, there's a deep physicality, a deep interactive stuff, which is in Christianity about engagement. It's not running away. There's a different emphasis in some traditions, even in, for example, if you compare the Buddha's sense of decay and how important it was, it's different from the Christian sense, which is an embracing of the totality, including of suffering, in a different way. So they do come to different results, because a lot of the transhumanist argument is based on wanting to avoid suffering as well. Now, I don't want to oversimplify Buddhism, but in relation to some Western Buddhists and how they articulate it. So, but in all that, the spirit is transcendent. The spirit is part of an immanent and transcendent divine, and we have to focus on that. The nature of our spirituality is of the nature of light, that we're part of a spiritual light. Light is right throughout the thing. But in this incarnation, we are in the flesh, and we have to operate in this environment. And I believe that we're meant to spiritually evolve in this context, on this planet, in this natural world, that it isn't the dark place that people keep telling it is, that it's incredible. I have a different, I notice more and more people and spiritual people are saying, oh, you know, we're trapped in a kind of Gnostic view. The material world is horrible, and how am I come here, and all this kind of stuff. As Philip K. Dick said, you know, if you think this world is bad, you want to see a lot of other ones. And there's a lot of people are fascinated. They want to invest all their spiritual exploration in entering into worlds with machine elves and insects and things. I don't want to be in that. The mystics say that, you know, that's a lower kind of plane. I don't know why they want to be in there, why they find it exciting, but that's not who we are. And the mystical approach, and particularly mystical Christianity, but is there in Buddhism as well, is to return to the higher, to evolve to the higher things. So I really don't understand this fascination with the lower things, because it's, I do understand it's a need for sensation. We've been programmed so much, programmed literally, to expect sensation, that spirituality has to be sensational, meaning that it has to impact on our physiology for people to believe that's spiritual. But that's not. That's about something which is sensate or sentimental, as William Butler Yeats would say. So the compassion is a key thing. That's me recognizing who you are. And forgiveness. I know it sounds corny on that, but in the new world, there's no forgiveness. If they say, Michael, you said something wrong 50 years ago, you're out. There's no forgiveness for you. You're punished. They will enforce this punishment forever. You can't. There's no forgiveness in it. It's the most unforgiving things. They criticize Christianity, but they will punish you as much as they can. And one more point, you said about, because I mentioned about sadism before, because I think this is the key. The new world order will be sadistic. There will be a strong sadomasochistic thing. For the citizen, it will be an encouraged masochism. Oh yeah, succumbing to this process. But there will be some kind of fetishistic kind of approach from our leaders. And actually, if you want to see the pedigree of this, there's a strange connection as well, that in a number of the analyses of the origin of post-structuralism and some of these ideas, it goes back to Foucault and back to Georges Bataille, a French philosopher. He's seen to be the kind of father of a lot of these subsequent ideas. And he was quite big into eroticism, and this there was a kind of sadistic element, and he refers to Marquis de Sade a lot. And so he's kind of the father of post-structuralism in many senses. There's a direct connection. He had a secret society and a magazine. It was called Acéphale. Okay, so there's suggestions as well that this was encouraging human sacrifice. You can read about in the Standard thing. There was an idea of a kind of going back to the roots and recovering human sacrifice. I mean, this is all in there. This is all in this stuff that's awaiting us. I mean, so it's just so people don't are under no illusions about what's facing them as they're giving up, the Western culture.
And what was his reason for this? Just because it was part of our history? Why did he want to bring this back?
That's another story, but a lot of it is about there was a Nietzschean view as well about this. Who is this superhuman? You can see it in other people who are less extreme, like Gerald Heard. He believed that evolution was going to be through pain. And a lot of people have kind of not paid attention to what they're saying. I think there's a much deeper, unpleasant basis to that. But Acéphale, so this is the key organization he sets up. What does that mean? It means headless. The symbol was of the body without a head. And when I see it, when I saw that symbol, I said, okay, that's this. This is the same. This is the same thing. Because of course, you take the head off, you just have the sacrificial body. So this is a thing that they're using. This is the occult basis of what people are succumbing to. So people assume this is what Edgar Allan Poe talked about. Another word to finish off on that, which has been in my mind a lot. I've used the word. I have a new book coming out, and I've used the word to describe this encroachment by technology. I call it immure mentalization, to refer to.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, immure mentalization. So to immure someone is to put them in a wall or surround them by a wall. It's just another strange connection with this. When you follow them. So immure mentalization, all this stuff is surrounding you. It's isolating you. So eventually you're dependent on it. You won't be able to get out. This is a method in the story, The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. He had this idea or feeling about, being locked in. So in that, a figure is effectively buried alive. He's trapped through his own greed for this wine, and when he wakes up, his mate is building him into a wall. Not very pleasant. This is what's happening to us. This is what's happening to our mental state. This is what the system is. And strangely, in thinking about and looking at the connection with the garment, the chiton, they say it was prefigured by Proverbs, which is 22:18. And there's one line in that which kind of in the proverb, which anticipates this garment incident with Jesus, seemed to anticipate. They said that in the King James Version, it says, "The assembly of the wicked will enclose you," or enclose me. The assembly of the wicked will enclose me. Enclose. So the idea that the enclosure it's a critical thing. This is what's happening in relation to the spreading of technology. We're being assimilated into the technology, made dependent. As they say, Bill Gates has said it from the 90s, hook the children, get them addicted. They mean that literally. Get them addicted, get them focused, get them dependent, have your digital currency, have your ID things, have crisis so that people are dependent on it, make them work at home, make them stay at home, make them be isolated, make them, invent all kinds of things. Yesterday or last week, they were sending out texts to everyone in America about, obviously the mobile phones are a method for the state to interfere directly in your nervous system, directly. Anticipated in books, Nerves of Government, Carl Deutsch, 1969, I think. They've been doing that for a year. This is what people every day, we're all succumbing to this. So we just have to, all I'm saying is you just have to be aware that if you believe in your eternal soul, that this is what the game is about. And the argument is that if people don't start reacting, informing themselves, giving up to some of the things that they're not willing to sacrifice, their computer games and their football matches, and okay, well, if you want to go down that way, that's grand, that's your choice. But I mean, really, it requires something of a different order, and it requires criticism, re-examination, reimagination, a requirement that we look back at things that we think we know, and we take ownership of these things. We don't let experts take things, whether control of our body, control of our stories, control of our religion, control of the places that we worship, whatever, nature. It's all gone. As George Carlin said, they want everything. And that was literally, they want your soul as well. People don't understand that. But that's consistent. That's what they're consistently saying again and again. And you only have to look at the history of the Roman Empire, the history of other empires to understand how real this is. And now we're allowing the formation of an international, global cartel, originated empire and an international commerce based on technology that want to establish a technotronic society to control every aspect, not just of our life, but of nature. You know, they're talking about our bees being linked into information systems, all the creatures in the sea. It's what John Lilly talks about. Everything wired up. It's the Nova scene. This is what's on the table. There is no other alternative on the plan. There is no thing. There's no alternative plan that I can see. And all of this is the military, industrial, security, pharmaceutical complex being applied. Everything is, and people think, oh, I hear people saying, oh, we've won now, they're retreating. It's just a different point of pressure. It's like in a grappling match. When you're grappling with someone, they might be trying to get your foot or your arm or your neck or something like that, or moving, but they often improving their position bit by bit. A different point of attack doesn't mean that they've forgotten about some ultimate point of attack. And what I'm saying is we have to really wake up if we want to this is my belief, to save the race as we know it, to save humanity and to save our own souls.
It's difficult, as I said to you the last time I was speaking to you. You know, I'm trying to be aware of it myself. You know, if I'm doing something, I'll leave my phone aside. But it's very difficult. Not like, for example, myself, I'll be like checking my Instagram or checking what's going on Twitter or what else. It's very, very addictive, you know. And in the morning times now, I'm purposely just not turning on my phone until I leave it in sleep mode, or excuse me, airplane mode, until I've made my coffee and meditated, and I'll say I'll pray. And after that, then I'll turn on my phone. But it's in the back of my mind, it's like, you know, it's the force is so strong, it's so addictive. You mentioned Edgar Allan Poe. Did you ever read the story, The Man of the Crowd? The man of the crowd. I don't know which preposition, but over in the man in the crowd, the man of the crowd.
I've read most of the stories. I can't remember the details of it, but I'm pretty but I can't remember. I've read, I think, all of it.
It's about the guy. He's in a cafe and he's looking out at all the people walking to and fro, and he follows this one particular man, and he follows him the whole night, and he follows him until the next morning. And when he looks at him, the guy looks back at him, and he's like got this kind of blank, inhuman stare to him. And basically Poe, I think, was getting at, this is a symbol, a figure of modernity, of where people are going. The man of the crowd, the man in the crowd.
Yes.
Basically this guy was just it was like a machine almost.
Well, that's right. And that also, it parallels Rene Descartes looking out the window and imagining that people are automatons. And that's right. Yeah, he had a I'm going to do a talk about him, I think, soon, but so I'll be reminding myself of some of the ones that I've forgotten about. But he had a sense that reason was not what it's cracked up to be. And as I've said before, the Marquis de Sade is a champion of reason. He didn't believe that the humans were, that reason was the supreme value. It was a kind of tool. And he also believed that there was always going to be perversity in free will, that it had to go. So the assumption of constant, reasonable rationality was not there. And I think it was a healthier view in relation to understanding. He also wrote Eureka, which is a kind of, people can't make out whether it's genius or empty. It's a cosmological perspective, a whole cosmological perspective, as well as anticipating issues about cryptography and magic and the detective story and rational human. And another interest, and this is the oddity of synchronicity. It's quite remarkable, and this is why you have to look at it in different ways, right? I did a talk about Russell Square with Jeff on New Thinking Aloud, about the significance of Russell Square. Now, people might find it an odd thing, it's psychogeography, if you like, but it's a crucible. I've argued that it's a crucible of consciousness that for some reason, which I could explain, but for some reason, this area around Russell Square, British Museum, was where a lot of things came from. I won't rehearse all that, but you have Marx there, you have William Butler Yeats, and Edgar Allan Poe lived there as well, which is crucial
Really?
as
I
well.
didn't know that.
Yeah, he lived on Southampton Row there as well, which is it's just remarkable. So then, and look at this. Now, so my argument is that there's something in this area that has made it a crucible of consciousness. Okay. So if my theory is right, it should be relevant to kind of the stuff that's going on at the moment. Where did deep mind start off? The first office is in Russell Square. The same thing. Now I only became conscious of that recently, but it's absolutely predictable on this different way of thinking that deep mind started off there, and they've only moved up the road in the bigger offices when Google took them over to King's Cross. Again, I've talked about the connections near where it's unbelievable, Michael. If one is telling me that this is just a coincidence, in a strange way, near where Lenin met Trotsky for the first time, near where the Bolsheviks set up the newspaper and were formed in London. I say, okay, well, it's just a coincidence. Near where H.G. Wells lived, it's just a coincidence. It's not. The world works in different ways. So on a higher level, what you have to look at is meaningful and consistent connections and patterns that are not necessarily anticipated by other methods. And when you look at it at a different level, you can see different patterns that begin to corroborate, reinforce arguments, or point you in the right direction to a higher level where you can begin to see the interconnection. Because if everything is fragmented, separated, it's incoherent and you can't see it, and it's meant to be so. But it's quite remarkable. And I could easily make out the connection between magic and deep mind, and people wouldn't believe that to be the case, but it's easy in many ways to also. Who lived in Russell Square just beside a J.D. Bernal, The World of Flesh and the Devil. It's ridiculous. And then you get his friend coming to visit him, Pablo Picasso. Did a painting on his wall. You say, well, okay, this tells me something about Picasso. He's so you have to follow up patterns, historical patterns, look at the evidence, but also be able to look at things on a different level in order to understand, because really it's a deep thing that we're engaged in. It's a deep issue. There's a deep argument, and we have to approach it with the power of insights of the artists and the poets and what they're telling us. And each contributed different things, gave us different angles, gave us different insights that we really have to open our mind to if we want to solve these things. I agree with you about the technology. I'm not claiming I'm great myself. I do my best, but obviously when I've been writing books and writing 10 books in the last couple of years, I can't get off this thing because I'm making reference and things like that. That's just the way. I mean, I'd be quite happy to give all that, and I probably will give it all at a certain stage, but not until I've articulated as best as I can an analysis that's robust and that people can understand. I feel I have to do that. I don't. It may be that I don't get the opportunity not to do that at this stage. That I have to continue with to the thing, and in that context, I have to be involved in all this kind of stuff, with all the good, the bad, and the ugly. Despite the fact that I haven't got a television, mobile phone, I don't go to concerts and things like that. I don't go to a lot of social things anymore. I'm not interested in. I have enough good social things here.
Do you write longhand, or do you use a computer always?
I use the computer now, but I have, as I said, 10. I think this is the 10th book. But there's a stack of them there floating around, half completed that emerge at particular times. And I'm going to do that because if I can provide an explanation that is robust, is testable, that people can apply, I'll be happy. And my children are going to live in this world, so they're living in this world. It's not going to get better if we stand by. So I have an obligation to do that. It doesn't guarantee success in it, and if you're doing a critical thing, you're obviously going against the tide. So I'd much prefer not to have any involvement in the technology and to be out doing things and make a big effort, like to swim every day, up the woods every day, and to balance it out, and to have me a little monastic bit to myself in relation to doing the things that you should do, communicate with the universe, nature, people, and divine consciousness, whatever way you conceive that, whatever systems. That they're things that we have to do and balance. And take an Alvin Toffler, the techno rebel and non-violent approach. We have to master the things as well. We have to know what's out there and understand it as well in order to be able to be imaginative. So we can't be Luddite about this. There's no escape in this system. So that's for everybody, but we have to realize what's going on in the process. And it's often more on a more mundane level about how people sacrifice informal contact for formal contact through machines. There's a lot of things they could do to reduce it, or just simple things like eating together, where these are things that are getting compromised. Sharing time with people face to face, all those simple things are important. So another thing, I think actually the Last Supper has a different connotation about the communion, about actually meeting people. It has a different meaning as well as the other meanings to it. It's about the necessity for conviviality, as Illich talked about, the necessity not to prize face-to-face contact where important, and also doesn't stop us using as we're using it now. Hopefully we'll have some little effect somewhere from it. You don't know how something can have an effect, so we can't eschew these things, and using it for good purposes is part of the thing. So it's better to try and master some of the things, and also another concept in this: try and convince people on the other side of the argument. What's called elite defection. Try and persuade other people that spiritual consciousness is real. This is not nonsense stuff that's out there. That it's deep stuff. It's deep stuff that they haven't understood, and that also in the context of elite defection, that there's good reasons why they should. One, because a lot of them will end up where the people that think are lesser than them will be. It happens in all the cases. Look at what happened to the Bolsheviks. Read the House of Government, for example. All the Bolsheviks, it didn't end up well for a lot of the people that gave their energy to this new project. It won't end up well for a lot of these people. They'll be sacrificed, the ones that help this come into being, or that acquiesce in the creation of this great totalitarian state. It won't be good for them. And if you believe in a spiritual consciousness, this cannot be good. And there's also the other danger that if they're involved in this thing, they may have blood on their hands in the future. Because really, if you build up a totalitarian system, you have to, and you're part of that, you really have to morally take the responsibility for these things happen because people are involved in them. So there's good reason not to be involved in some great reckless Promethean venture that you don't know what the consequences are. So really, we have to persuade people. We don't have to. We shouldn't be condemning people that are telling us what their viewpoints are at this stage. We should listen to it, and also seek to persuade and to seek to provide robust alternatives, robust analysis to make them understand. Because a lot of them are grossly ignorant about the history of their own position, where they've got to, have swallowed a lot of propaganda, have been on the computer for too long, brought up on computer games. For example, PewDiePie, who's I think one of the most successful YouTubers ever, he's from Gothenburg. But he was talking about books. He started reading books, and he said that he used to read books, but because he was on computers for 10 years, he didn't read a book. So obviously the guy is very intelligent, but it just shows you that the interest in computer games could take 10 years of reading out of your life. that's very, very significant especially for young men. It's really impoverishing, and what you get a diet of first person shooter killing. It's not good. It's not good. So there's levels to the issues about. There's no question it's addictive. It's meant to be addictive, but we should seek balance, to seek to counterweight, as you said, doing your sacred practices, recognizing the sacred element, the transcendent element, and that grows the more you invest in that. And particularly if you're using it for a positive purpose, that's a good thing. And you certainly are in doing your work with your channel and putting different viewpoints in there. So I don't have the problem with a phone, thankfully. So, but I can see it all around me. It's.
Did you ever have a mobile phone? Did you ever own?
No.
Wow.
I just had an instinct against them, and
wow.
I do against a lot of machines actually. But I've always been interested in the communication aspect, the communication technology in relation to its possibilities for dialogue, for genuine dialogue, as opposed to, I'm on the bus now coming home, and that kind of use of the technology, that stuff. Or there's a big problem now, even in the mainstream media. They're talking that a lot of young men are falling in love with, well, that means with artificial intelligent girlfriends. They're not entering into relationships. This is becoming a problem. There's a huge industry in relation to sex bot, and that's going to get more against a movement away from the human thing. And this is devastating. This is devastating on a whole range of levels. When you throw in then as well the ectogenesis, the birth of the baby outside of the womb as they're moving towards. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible, but we're living in incomprehensible times. And it's only going to get more accentuated. So therefore, we have to vindicate, ultimately, in the long run, and it could be disastrous before that, the spirit will triumph. The question is whether you have given up your spirit before. It may not happen in our lifetime, but the spirit will triumph. I don't have any doubt about that. We're meant to be. The spiritual consciousness will persist, but before that we can have very dark periods, and that's what we want to try.
It's very tempting to just sit back and say, well, it's going to happen anyways. It's inevitable. So what can I do about it? It's very tempting to acquiesce in that way, but you're right. We have to put in our 2 cents. We have to put in our effort as well to, just to do our bit for it.
It's. I'm going to do a talk about Garabandal as well. It's quite interesting. The Spanish connection, and I was there during the summer as well. But we have this idea which comes in a lot of a choice, that you're going to be faced with a choice. And the choice is really between, it's not necessarily about the Catholic Church, the choice is between a spiritual path and a materialist path. It's as simple as that. To recognize that your spiritual beings are not both the neoliberal military industrial complex and the communist materialist. They both share that materialism as the base of the deadly assault on humanity. And we have to realize that we're spiritual beings, spiritual consciousness, and that nothing will be right until we recognize that. So the people that are warring against that, they will have to take the spiritual consequences. They don't believe in the spiritual things, that's fine, but let that unfold in its own way. But I say to the good people, don't let yourself be dragged down into this miasma, into this slow road to hell. And the hell doesn't have to be the medieval Christian hell. It's a place where your spirit is in a grey world which doesn't because it hasn't believed in those, or it doesn't understand, or is not convinced about the reality of that. There's different ways that we approach it, but acquiescence and assuming the reality of an illusion is what all the spiritual traditions warn us about. If one wants that, it's very seductive. It's getting more seductive. But in spiritual terms, I think we will pay a big price, and I think it's necessary to be positively disillusioned in order to see beyond that.
James, would you like to tell people where they can find your work?
I have a website, which is the only place. I don't do any other social media, so it's jamestunney.com, and there's a site there, so you can have a look at that, and there's reference to my books and that, so they can there's a stream of books on the way. I'm just finishing one on artificial intelligence and myth, so that'll be out hopefully this week, and a few more on the way. So
James, it's been great listening to you. Thank you so much for coming on, and I really enjoyed listening to you and talking to you. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm sure we'll continue the conversation. And thanks for the opportunity, and good luck with your other interesting interviews. So thanks again, Michael, and good luck to you.
Thanks, James. Thanks.